Elia Suleiman's 2009 film, The Time That Remains, makes me wish so desperately that it could be re-released today in just the right way so that it could find a cult following. Or if I'm being even more ambitious, by some miracle make its way to a general audience. Unfortunately, if I'm coming back down to earth, I know deep down that a movie like this could probably never reach mainstream box office success. That being said, it deserves so much more than the niche little corner of world cinema that it's in. I first watched this pièce de résistance back in January during a local theater's retrospective of Suleiman's work. I was blown away while watching this movie. I mean, it's gorgeous. On my walk home, I kept thinking to myself, this is exactly the kind of movie that reminds me why I love movies so much. When I really love something, sometimes I'll wait years before I watch it again, because I'm ridiculous, but also because I get a little scared of it losing its magic. Though I've had to watch it a couple more times in order to make this video, and luckily I regret nothing.
Yeah, let me present you to my very good friend, Elia Suleiman. He's a Palestinian filmmaker.
Nice to meet you.
But he makes funny films.
In this video, I'd like to talk about Suleiman's career, specifically the progression of work that led to him creating what I believe to be his magnum opus. I'd also like to discuss some of his ideas around film, some of the historical context for the movie, and of course why I love it so much and believe it's an indispensable work, not just for one's political consciousness, but more importantly, for one's own education of art and film. I hope that you'll take the time to watch with patience and openness as we go through the progression of his work. My aim is for us to collectively try to learn something from him. Also, sorry in advance if you notice things in the background disappearing. We didn't have any of our things yet when we first started filming this video, and we're only now finally putting everything together. Suleiman's filmic career starts with his 1990 film, Introduction to the End of an Argument. This experimental documentary pulls together and collages snippets of both film and television in order to tug at the seams of the greater ideology that's made a lot of horrific things in this region possible over the past century. It parses through some of the language that helped establish and reinforce the West's use of the word terror in order to dehumanize an entire people and justify the unjustifiable. In this piece, much like the rest of his work where he plays a silent protagonist, he doesn't really need to say anything. It's technically classified as a documentary, and though it doesn't follow the story of one specific person, place, or event, it serves as a documentation of all of this media history, and it holds it and us accountable. Watching it all is almost cacophonous, definitely upsetting, and maybe even a little disturbing. I think it confronts what feels like an epidemic of poor media literacy, and we're asked to reckon with what we've collectively let penetrate the cultural consciousness. I mean, I Dream of Jeannie was one of my favorite shows as a kid. In a sense, we're being told this says more about you than it does about me. This piece shows the depth of his engagement with media, which I think is necessary for him to actualize his future work. I'm honestly frustrated and disappointed that in all of the video art classes I took in college, this documentary never came up, though I'm not surprised. Introduction to the End of an Argument reminds me a lot of Martha Rosler's work, specifically her photo montages from the series House Beautiful, Bringing the War Home, and her video piece, Semiotics of the Kitchen. On the MoMA page for House Beautiful, it says, by tying the destruction abroad to untroubled affluence at home, Rosler gave visual form to the description of the conflicts as the Living Room War, so called because it was the first war to be televised. House Beautiful and Introduction are montages that speak to how domestic and war industries are connected. We're talking about the first war to be televised and the first genocide to be live streamed from our phones. Semiotics of the Kitchen is performance-based, but both it and Introduction are videos that take a very matter-of-fact approach to dissecting the lexicon of oppressive industries. I wanted to take my time talking about this first film because I feel like first films are one of our best tools for framing and understanding a filmmaker's later, more realized works. In some ways, a first film is kind of a blueprint that can help us start learning their language. In this work, we see how Suleiman pieces together fragments, how he uses a loose or non-narrative structure, and how there's a silent poeticism or whispering wisdom that asks us to slow down and be witnesses to what we're observing. 1993's Homage by Assassination is an impressive first short that takes place entirely in Suleiman's New York City apartment. It's a testament to what he's able to achieve with limited resources. A lot of his work is about reclamation, and one of the ways we see that in this piece is when he replaces the English alphabet on his keyboard with the Arabic one. With this gesture, he protests the denial to a voice. 3 attempts at communication play out. The first is a phone call that can't come through, the second is a phone call that goes straight to voicemail, and the third is a fax. I think all 3 are poignant, but I'd like to focus on the third. The film considers the tension between being rendered voiceless and the struggle to articulate. My mom had a dicho when I was little that went, gallinas plumadas pluma se queda. What this translates to more or less is that once you've plucked all of a hen's feathers, you can't just unpluck them. Basically, once you've talked a lot of shit and have stripped someone of their dignity and their right to speak their own identity, it's really hard to prevent or undo the consequences of that. I believe that the Palestinian voice is the single most important one to understanding what's currently playing out in occupied Palestine. But the other voice that's been not just systematically silenced, but whose history has been nearly erased is that of the Arab Jewish person. I think it's really beautiful the way that Suleiman privileges Elia Suleiman's voice over his own in Homage.
As an Arab Jew, the dilemma of my identity has become almost dizzying. Most of my family was born and raised in Baghdad and now lives in Israel, the US, England, and Iraq. When my grandmother arrived in Israel in the early 50s, she was convinced that the European Jews she encountered who looked, spoke, and ate so differently were actually European Christians. Jewishness for her generation was associated with Middle Easternness. My grandmother, who lives in Israel and still speaks only Arabic, had to be taught to speak of us as Jews and them as Arabs.
There's also a really striking moment of prose where he uses the word terrorism to the point where it almost induces semantic satiation, which is not unlike how it's used in the real world. I think this is a really beautiful and poetic short, and I'm so glad that it exists. Also, if you can, get your hands on a copy of Hanan al-Cinema, Affections for the Moving Image by Laura U. Marks. I highly recommend the second chapter, The Language of Terrorism, Elia Suleiman's film practice. The last 3 paragraphs, which cite 1,000 Plateaus and the Newly Born Woman, brought tears to my eyes. So I'd like to end the homage chapter of this video with the first of those 3 paragraphs. Landless nations return, as that which is repressed returns, to remind the dominant power of what it had to deny in order to conceive of itself as a unified entity. The state itself has always been in a relation to an outside, and it is inconceivable independent of that relationship. Like the hysteric in the Victorian family, the Palestinian is figured as irrational, an aberration, someone to be shut off from the public, threatened and appeased. Yet the hysteric is necessary to the survival of her culture, as the stage of her body on which her culture's unbearable contradictions are played out as symptoms. 1996's Chronicle of a Disappearance is Suleiman's first feature-length film. According to a summer 1997 issue of Artforum, thanks to the nonprofit distributor International Film Circuit, it was the rare film on the subject of Palestine to be released nationally in the United States. I think getting a film like this released in the 90s in the US is a huge deal. How many Palestinian films even get to be produced? Like, what a monumental accomplishment. In this film, we start to see him develop his meticulous yet detached tableaus. He says that the film borders between fiction and nonfiction, and that the majority of the film is either based off of something he's witnessed or a story shared by someone close to him. He actually would spend time at the souvenir shop that's featured in the film, and he then added choreographed elements onto those observations, experiences, and narratives. Some of the scenes express a loss of culture and identity for Arab people, and I think the man in the souvenir shop filling the bottles of holy water from the tap is an amusing expression of this. A lot of the tableaus feel like ballads portraying Palestinian life. I love the portraits of his family in this film so much. I have older parents, and Fouad and Nadsira Suleiman could literally be stand-ins for them. Opening the film with a close-up of his father asleep on the couch is just so humanist, and is such an accessible image to so many of us. I'm also a really big fan of his gossipy aunt. There's a scene where Israeli police officers get out of their vehicle to pee, and one of them drops their walkie-talkie. In my opinion, this scene is pivotal in Suleiman's work because this is where fantastical elements start being introduced. For me, it kind of resembled watching a clown car. On this set, he'd been waiting for an accident that could motivate him to include some sort of narrative structure to the project. And when the actor dropped the walkie-talkie, he describes this moment as a seed for the plot. After seeing this take, he literally sent his crew back home and started rewriting the film. This openness to experimentation and serendipity inaugurates this pivotal shift in the development of his language. He decides to give this walkie-talkie to Adon, a woman he met in an earlier scene in a real estate office, whom we follow to a payphone where she's making a series of calls. My favorite part about Adon is the way that she challenges the audience's preconceptions of Arab women. Her sort of gothy, mysterious personality could lead to an interpretation of her character as being suspicious or nefarious. But what does she choose to do with the power that comes with this walkie-talkie? In this act of reclamation, she pranks the police and orchestrates a wild goose chase that sends police vehicles swirling around aimlessly. Ola Tabari exudes this incredible, almost like PJ Harvey-esque epitome of 90s coolness. Apparently, when he was making this first feature, there wasn't a lot of desire from people to participate in making the film because they didn't really know what making a film meant. When asked about the origins of his work, in an interview with the publication Little White Lies, Suleiman responded, "I was rejected nonstop when I was trying to set up my first feature. At that time in the mid-90s, there weren't a lot of Palestinian filmmakers per se, and the lefties in the Occidental film world were very patronizing about Palestine. They wanted to speak about it and not let you speak about it. So they were affronted by the comedy in the script. They knew that Palestinians never laughed because they were far too busy being tortured and tormented by the Israelis. This was not reality, so one French producer was convinced I was a fake Palestinian. I'd been living in New York, so I was told, go back to your America. That's the hypocrisy of the French left. They have all this anger towards America, but of course, they really love it." He illustrates this feeling of not being allowed to speak in a scene where his character is being introduced as a filmmaker and he can't actually start his talk. The audience is speaking, a baby is crying, his microphone starts giving feedback, people's cell phones start ringing, and everyone is shuffling in their seats. There's a whole tango to the scene, and it feels overwhelmingly like being in a bizarre nightmare where you're trying to scream and you just can't. This oppressive desire to speak while simultaneously being denied that is a reality of Palestinian life, and he'll continue to capture the sentiment so well throughout all of his work. It's really moving that he ends I'm actually crying. It's really moving that he ends the film with a dedication to his parents that reads, "To my mother and father, the last homeland." Sorry, I get a little emotional. His work is just really beautiful to me. "1999 Cyber Palestine" is a modernized adaptation of Mary and Joseph's journey from Nazareth, Suleiman's birthplace, to Bethlehem, except in this iteration they travel from Gaza to Israel. It's a little hard to find, but it's only 15 minutes and I love its early internet aesthetic. It's a perfect little short for the new millennium. There were a lot of great details, like the angel Gabriel calling Mary on a little Nokia bar phone, and Joseph's Yahoo search for Cyber Palestine resulting in a webpage that's under construction. These interior shots are all happening with the pre-1948 Visit Palestine poster in the background. This piece, much like all of Suleiman's work, is a sort of hushed conversation between the past, the present, and to some degree, the future. There's a moment in this film where this sort of holy light is washing over them, and it's all obviously very low budget, but in classic Suleiman fashion, he's framing this expecting couple just so beautifully, and I think there's an element of his fantastical humor here too. And this fantastical humor is something that we're going to continue to see in his work. As they're packing, we see historical images of the Nakba, and the question of exile is brought before us. At the beginning of their journey, their car won't start, and it looks like they're gonna have to take a donkey to Bethlehem, but then marvelously enough, a motorcycle suddenly appears. Once they reach a military checkpoint, Joseph is beaten by multiple IOF soldiers, and this is followed by a montage of what feels like hopeless scenes of Palestinian civilians clashing with the IOF. The film ends with a hopeful image for humanity of a brave and modern Mary and her baby riding into the distance. This film is super referential to the silent film era with its title cards and choice of music. I really lament not being able to have found a higher quality copy. It is so clear in all of his films, even in his shorts, no matter how scrappy they may be, that he is such an auteur. Suleiman's second feature, Divine Intervention, came out in 2002, during a time that was rife with Islamophobia and anti-Arab sentiments, especially in the US. It's important to understand that the environment that he was releasing his film into was especially hostile and prejudiced. I want to talk a little bit about the film's Oscars controversy because I feel like it's a useful indicator of how neoliberal institutions in Hollywood receive his work, and by extension, the West's lack of regard for Palestinians and Arabs. According to an article in Electronic Intifada, the director of communications for the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences says that the film was never considered for nomination because it was never formally submitted to the Foreign Language Film Committee. Apparently, the co-president of the company that distributed Divine Intervention released the statement that was approved by the film's producer. The producer of Divine Intervention asked the Academy if the film could run for Best Foreign Language Picture. The answer of the Academy was no. Palestine is not a state we recognize in our rules. It seems that the problem was more than just the filmmakers not submitting, because it looks like they might have actually been discouraged from even trying to submit, despite the fact that the Academy's reasoning was inconsistent with their actual practices. Because of the controversy, the film was submitted the following year and still wasn't nominated. As always, there's links down below for anyone who wants to read further. If I'm being real, I've actually never watched the Oscars, and I honestly hold that ceremony in very low esteem. In 2003, the year that Divine Intervention should have been in the running, the Oscars were especially ridiculous, which I feel like I say every year. Y Tu Mamá También wasn't even nominated for Best Cinematography in 2003, and I feel like that alone says everything there is to say about the Oscars. It lost Best Original Screenplay and was somehow nominated for literally nothing else. The film that did win for Best Foreign Picture that year seems like, and I'm sure is, a white savior film. And lastly, Suleiman does not need the Oscars. No talented filmmaker does. His work is too imaginative, disruptive, and necessary. They need him far more than he needs them. The beginning portion of Divine Intervention is titled A Chronicle of Love and Pain. Divine Intervention demonstrates really well the way that frustrations around systemic hostilities can be reproduced and how they can begin to manifest inward. We witness a series of aggressions between neighbors throughout the film. A lot of these aggressions are reoccurring, and they feel like a back and forth. There's what feels like a tennis game between two neighbors where one throws trash in the other's garden and the other throws it right back in his yard. Eventually, one neighbor says,
ليش بتفتحينيش في الأول؟ مش عشان هيك الله أعطانا لسنات؟
We see these neighbors take out their frustrations around occupation on one another because there's nowhere else to direct those feelings. When asked about this scene, Suleiman says, when there is no love, when people live in a ghetto, they start to fight each other. There were two interactions that have really stuck with me after watching this film. The first is one where a man frustratedly tells another man who's loitering outside of his home that the bus isn't coming. The other man is pretty unaffected, says that he knows, and continues to wait, leaning against the bus stop. The same interaction occurs on multiple occasions. One day, some graffiti appears that says, "I'm crazy because I love you," and the men just look at each other and don't say anything. A lot of these vignettes between the neighbors feel like we're watching a family annoy each other, and I couldn't help but feel that these characters still love each other through everything. The second was one where a French tourist asks an Israeli police officer for directions. This super silly situation plays out as the officer pulls a blindfolded Palestinian prisoner from the back of his vehicle, and the prisoner proceeds to give multiple route options while blindfolded. According to an interview in The Guardian, Suleiman says that the scene was based on a real event. This is one of those scenes that feels like you couldn't even make it up if you tried, because it's so absurd in its truthfulness. This absurdity expands into the fantastical when ES throws a peach pit at a tank, causing it to explode. This scene actually had to be shot in France to get around crediting the Israeli military. When asked about this scene, he said, "All human beings should hate these instruments of war." So I feel like one of the most iconic and slept on moments in all of cinematic history is in this film, when our unnamed woman, played by Manal Kader, crosses a military checkpoint. Like, that military checkpoint is her runway. Like, she's coming off of Prada's Spring-Summer 2002 show, in look 29 to be exact. She breaks the fourth wall, and just the sustained eye contact with the IOF soldiers and the sustained eye contact with the audience, I mean, talk about resistance. What more is there to say? I love the reference to action movies here and the explosion walk as she walks away from the collapsing tower. An absolutely spellbinding moment. I love Suleiman's love of a mysterious hot girl, and who can blame him? ES and our MHG have to meet at the Al-Ram checkpoint because he lives in Jerusalem and she lives in Ramallah in the West Bank. It's hard to not be captivated by the star-crossed lovers of it all. When they're together, they don't even speak. They just hold hands, and it's so tender. There's a title card at this point in the film, and it says, "I'm crazy because I love you," just like the graffiti from earlier. It's so beautiful. In the following scene, he blows up a balloon with Yasser Arafat's face on it. The balloon distracts the IOF soldiers, and then in what feels like a dream sequence, they and the balloon are able to cross the checkpoint. It's so funny to watch the soldiers freak out over the balloon. This whole charade says a lot about the absurdity around borders and walls and how ideas are never really limited by either of those things. In Drew Paul's book, Israel Palestine, Border Representation in Literature and Film, the writer suggests that Divine Intervention stages the checkpoint as a site of fantasy and a theater of the absurd, as well as a staged charade of sovereignty and power. Everything about the depiction of the checkpoint feels so doofy, and this portrayal is an act of resistance to their very real danger. Perhaps one of the only times in the film where the depiction of violence feels actually scary is when we see a drunk soldier badgering, belittling, and stealing from Palestinians at the checkpoint. You watch these characters just fully submit to the humiliation. In this moment, the audience is just blasted into reality, and it's heart-wrenching to watch. In real life, the Israeli actor who played the drunk soldier dissociated himself from the film. Apparently, he didn't read the entire script and would not have taken part had he known that the film supports the Palestinian Authority. Suleiman, meanwhile, was full of compliments for this actor's performance and said, "I could not have found a better actor." I think Suleiman's open approach to filmmaking invites a lot of truths. The film culminates with our MHG, who's now a ninja, taking down a group of 5 armed Israeli men. The whole sequence is so campy and unforgettable. The soldiers, or they could be civilians, are doing target practice with targets that are made to look like Palestinian women. The scene is shot and choreographed in a way that makes these guys look like they're in a boy band. Suddenly, one of the targets becomes our MHG, and all of the bullets that are fired at her become her halo. My suspicion from her runway scene that she is in fact divine is confirmed here, where she's indestructible and her rocks are more powerful than their bullets. Her use of a shield that's in the shape of a pre-1948 Palestinian state feels so poetic and reclamatory. It feels like she's saying that through it all, it's her people that make her divine. All of this in the context of a scene that pays homage to the action film genre makes it so fun to watch. When asked about this scene, Suleiman said, "People all over the world were put off by this part of the film. When a cowboy murders thousands of Indians, that's okay. But as soon as one Indian does something, the audience automatically begins to criticize him. In my opinion, this is the first time in the history of cinema that the audience doesn't automatically identify with a woman who's being shot at by 6 men." Not only is he great at choreographing every individual tableau, but there's an elegance to how he balances emotionally heavy material with humor and fantastical elements with reality. After the highs of the ninja scene, we're almost at the end of the film, and we're brought back down to watch for a few moments as ES cries while cutting an onion. It's all very rhythmic. There's so many displays of pain and love in this film, and in this moment, he invites us to take a breath and process everything with him. Finally, the moment that you've been waiting for, we've reached the best movie you've never seen portion of this video. Thank you so much to anyone who's made it this far. I'd personally classify The Time That Remains as a masterpiece, and given everything that's going on, I wanted to take the time to honor and observe the development of Suleiman's work. His ideas around film are actually very similar to my own, and that's part of the reason for why I want it to be so exhaustive. He doesn't have many films, but if you're only gonna watch one, this is the one I would recommend. It is a thoroughly ambitious and successful project. Suleiman's synopsis of the film reads, "The Time That Remains is a semi-autobiographical film in 4 episodes about a family, my family, from 1948 until recent times. The film is inspired by my father's private diaries, starting from when he was a resistance fighter in 1948, and by my mother's letters to family members who were forced to leave the country. Combined with my intimate memories of them and with them, the film attempts to portray the daily life of those Palestinians who remained and were labeled Israeli Arabs, living as a minority in their own homeland." From what I've read about Palestinian cinema, it's very clear that it has its own repetitive and resistant history of theft, destruction, and reconstruction. According to a BFI interview, financing for this film collapsed weeks before it was set to start filming, and Suleiman had to find new funding. I feel really grateful that this film exists and that I've been able to witness it. In a Q&A at the Sarajevo Film Festival 2016, he said that when he first moved to New York, he didn't know anything about film. He said that his student friends would sneak him into classes at NYU and give him lists of books and films to watch. Initially, he watched more traditional narratives and anything that had to do with the Middle East, and he says, "I only wanted to see films that related to the Palestine-Israel issue, and only judge it on whether it's for us or against us. Mostly boring narratives and failed sort of films." He also says that it had interesting results because he started to have a more critical point of view. He began to feel that, quote, "these films aren't for us, even though they are for us," and that he had to find a way to somehow tell a story in a cinematic way beyond rights and wrongs. It's interesting to me that he's always compared to Buster Keaton and Jacques Tati, 2 of my fellow Libras, and the latter of whom is my favorite director. According to him, he'd never heard of them until he finished his first feature, and he was really struck by the similarities in their work. What I'm drawn to about this, as someone who's also had little to no cultural capital passed down to them, is how, through curiosity, artists from different backgrounds and different periods in history can reach the same conclusions. It's obvious that his work is very much in conversation with Keaton's and Tati's, and although they share certain similarities, they're each quite unique and exquisite. I learned the most about film and also about photography in high school when my after-school activities basically alternated between coming home and taking pictures and watching the Sundance Channel. Around this time in 2009, 2010, I started watching the Sundance Channel for its documentaries and to sort of expand my political consciousness. I naturally ended up watching a lot of indie movies. It was around this time that I started to realize that movies could be something other than entertainment or an inadequate replacement for history books and literature. And so I started to think of art as another language with which not only to read social reality, but also as a means to present an alternative. Although Suleiman is dealing with really emotionally and politically charged material, it never feels didactic. In fact, I'd say he challenges that every step of the way. His movies don't define resistance to us, they epitomize it. The film's opening scene is of a driver who has just picked ES up from the airport. There's no conversation. There's just the Israeli driver who's in control, speaking, while ES sits in the back. He breaks his own rule of smoking in his car. It feels visceral to watch the driver get lost and stuck in a torrential downpour. In this moment, I couldn't help but ask myself, where are they, and how did they get there? From here we transition to Nazareth in 1948. In a Q&A at Renoir Cinema in 2010, Suleiman talked about how some of the scenes in Nazareth, such as the moment where a Palestinian woman is shot by paramilitary who are disguised as Palestinians, were filmed in their exact same historical locations. They become a sort of shadow to the original event, and it's hard not to feel like a witness. As gruesome as some of these scenes are, Suleiman suggests that the events that took place in Nazareth were on a much smaller scale compared to the total devastation of 1948. Even as recently as 2022, according to the Central Bureau of Statistics of Israel, Nazareth is 99.7% Arab, functioning basically as a ghetto. One of the reasons why Nazareth was absorbed into Israel is because of its historical significance to the Abrahamic religions. David Ben-Gurion felt that it would be strategic to avoid conflict in Nazareth for fear of intervention from the Vatican. Nazareth in this film is a bridge for us to make connections between personal memory and global memory. In the 1948 portion of this film, we're invited to sit in on intimate moments that are repeatedly interrupted. The repetition of these interruptions reinforces how violent they are. The film is based on his father's diaries, but also on writing he asked his father to do before he passed away. Suleiman talks about how the only permit that he needed for filming was to knock on his neighbors' doors. With their help, he's essentially sharing with us the collective memories of his hometown, lest they be forgotten. In this way, the film resists the reading of history as a series of facts marked by major events, and instead favors everyday life and its felt experiences. I was really struck by something historian Shireen Sayali, who is the wife of the film's production designer Sharif Waked, discussed in a talk with UCTV. For those of you who have ever visited these refugee camps, you'll often find that people recreate their neighborhoods according to the villages that they're from. This actually happens with internal 1948 refugees inside Israel. I wonder if this film, to some degree, is an extension of that, of giving his people agency over their own stories. In some way, this affords them the right to return, if even in the imaginary, which in and of itself feels like a radical act of resistance. I couldn't find any interviews with the production designer Sharif Waked or the set designer Homage, but their work was meticulous. A lot of the scenes remind me of Milton Avery paintings. The blocks and wisps of colors are so harmonious. Sometimes even the wind on the leaves felt like a brush stroke over the scene. Even just the footsteps in this film sound like vintage recordings. Consistently, shot after shot could be its own standalone work, and the color palette of every frame is breathtaking. Also, the casting of Salah Bakri as Fouad Suleiman is one of those castings where it feels impossible to imagine anyone else in that role. He's very handsome, and he has so much stage presence. Like, he feels like he could be a Cary Grant of our time. Honestly, this movie needed a Salah Bakri winking at the camera moment. If you saw my last video, you know what I mean. It's wonderful to see how far Suleiman has come in this film compared to his first feature, where he struggled to find enthusiastic collaborators. Every crew member is working at the top of their game, and it shows with the amount of love and attention in every scene. Marc-André Bettine was his cinematographer for his first 3 films, and you can tell that he's also incredibly skilled. I think all 3 films are really impressive, obviously, but this film is just something else. Early on, you can tell that the direction for lighting and color grading in these films is super consistent, and that there is thorough and clear attention to detail in all visual aspects. In an interview with Bernard Eisenschitz, Suleiman says that he lights his films so that his audience can feel that they're actually in the space and not just a voyeur. I was reminded of the 400 Blows in the scenes where he portrays himself as a young student. His precociousness coupled with his rebelliousness reminds me a lot of Antoine Doinel's character. The repetition of getting in trouble and being pulled aside because of anti-imperialist remarks is kind of silly, but also very punk. Suleiman, much like Truffaut, constructs school or even the entire space of childhood to be authoritarian. In these childhood scenes, there are so many flags and flags and flags. You see the flags, you hear the flags. The children may as well be little flags themselves. In one of his mother's letters, she reveals that he was accused of tearing a flag as a kid. I don't know if he would agree to being called punk, but I feel like that sort of spirit comes from Fouad and Nadzira, especially after watching this film. I feel like his parents must be really, really cool people, considering that his work feels like it's as much about them as it is about him. He's made it clear how he feels about borders, walls, states, and flags. In an interview with France 24, he says this.
And I always said that I will fight for Palestine for the Palestinian flag to be raised, but when it will be raised, I'm going to fight for it to be lowered down. Simply because my issue is not about borders. My issue is about people having simply equality, that they are living in a secular society, that they choose whatever they want to do in a democratic state of being.
He doesn't believe in states and is very skeptical of nationalism, which I think after seeing how the 20th and early 21st century have played out, a lot of people could stand to adopt some of that wariness. I personally just feel like he and his work are super punk and super cool. I opened this video with a clip from his most recent feature where Gael Garcia Bernal talks about Suleiman's relationship to humor, as it's one of the central tenets of his work. So many of the techniques that he uses are absurdist and comedic, but also quite piercing. The scene in the club toward the end of the movie might be my favorite moment in the entire film. Clubs and dance floors have great potential to be liberatory spaces. The ritual of getting ready and going out has a special place in my heart and also in my own personal work. In this scene, all of the clubgoers are being lit from below as if by the dance floor itself. And because you can't see the light source from beneath them, the way they're glowing is honestly kind of heavenly. As the military jeep pulls up, the club feels impenetrable. The people keep dancing, and even the IOF official bops his head as he issues curfew orders that go unnoticed. The audience witnesses but never accesses this club space. We just get to be mesmerized by it as his wife Yasmin Hamdan's song Ma Rita plays in the background. Both the rhythm of the scene and our position as observers remind me of the living room scenes in my favorite film Playtime by Jacques Tati. The film's playfulness and whimsy gives us permission to conceptualize what we're not even allowed to dream about, let alone enact. In his world, nothing feels out of the question. When he pole vaults over the apartheid wall, it shatters everything that such a wall could represent, and suddenly it's inconsequential. The same can be said about the scene where a tank is following a Palestinian. The choreography is so funny as he takes out the trash and paces back and forth on his call. You get the sense that he's so used to the tank that it has no bearing on his day-to-day life. And then suddenly, the tank is pointing at us, and we're reminded of its weight. In this scene, the man is released of any danger, despite the fact that a literal tank is taking up 3/4 of the shot. In one of his interviews, Suleiman says that to laugh is to be Palestinian, and by making us laugh, he offers us his hand. His portrayal of Nazareth feels in some ways like limbo. His characters and the situations in his films often feel out of time. He uses a lot of the same locations throughout his movies. The consistency in all three films really reinforces our return to the same world, and the ongoing chronicling of real events suggests a trilogy. There's an atmosphere that moves through these first three features. We're repeatedly brought back to his parents' living room, kitchen, balcony, and the steps outside of their home. In both Chronicle of a Disappearance and The Time That Remains, we witness officials searching his parents' home at different points in their lives. The Holy Land souvenir shop is also reoccurring in both of these films. There's a persistent struggle to even just have moments that are all your own. We return over and over again to his father being interrupted by authorities while fishing along the shore. His mother sits on their balcony and grows older as she writes letters to relatives that she's likely to never see again. The Time That Remains is a memorial to his parents' life, their passing, and their specific place in history. There's a scene where we see Suleiman as a young man at his desk smoking a cigarette, and he looks out the window and sees young protesters resisting the IOF until one of them is shot. Decades later, he's an adult and looks out the window of a hospital and sees a new generation of young protesters resisting. These three films are so sharp in how they depict the ways that your entire world can shift, and how that same world can simultaneously stay exactly the same. I think there's a universality to this. His use of repetition is a marker of the passage of time, which recalls the title of the film. So what do we do with the time that remains. Oh my god, this ended up being a lot longer than I ever intended it to be. I thought this was gonna be like a quick 10-minute movie review, but here we are. It's just that the more research I did, the more enamored I became with his work and his approach to filmmaking. His thoughts on film and what I found of his worldview in general really resonated with some of my own conclusions. And I'm not surprised, considering that I was very specifically excited by and drawn to this film after watching it. In the time that I was writing and filming this video, we've watched the digitine unfold.
It's time for the people to conduct what I want to call a digital guillotine, a digitine if you will. It's time to block all the celebrities, influencers, and wealthy socialites who are not using their resources to help those in dire need.
This really made me appreciate the fact that Suleiman doesn't use or depend on celebrity in his work. He's working with his friends, family, neighbors, and the people in his community. He elevates everyday life in such a tender and poignant way. He does whatever he's compelled to do. And it's unbelievably moving to watch that lack of self-constraint in a film that feels so structurally solid and perfect in so many ways. The man just really likes to have fun. He gives us mysterious hot girls, he blows up tanks, and he shares his wife's bangers with us. That's something I didn't really touch on, but he knows how to handle a needle drop. If I was ever able to make a movie, I don't think that my approach would be too dissimilar. I didn't touch on this either, but I also really admire his friendship with John Berger. They were like family, and Suleiman describes Berger as something resembling a guardian angel. As someone who's also very moved by Berger's work, I think their relationship is really beautiful, and it speaks to both of their characters. He dedicated his fourth feature to Berger, who passed away a few months before its release. The language established by filmmakers like Keaton and Tati really works for the Palestinian struggle because their struggle is one that, in my opinion, shouldn't require a lot of explanation. I wholeheartedly believe that the Palestinian story is a narrative that could be told solely visually and still be perfectly understood. I really want to get this point across as clearly as possible, but this isn't a good film because it deals with Palestine necessarily. It's a masterpiece in its own right. Through all of the horror, Suleiman is an auteur who very clearly has a big heart and a love of humanity. I mean, it's apparent in every single frame. His work is dense with filmmaking craft and artistic vision. I really need Criterion or Martin Scorsese to remaster some Blu-rays of these movies. Like, I want the short films as bonus features. This is the world I'm manifesting for us. I'd like to end with this quote from an interview with Electronic Intifada. When I make a film, I do not have any impulse when I'm composing an image of raising the consciousness of the world about Palestine. If by de facto the spectator feels an identification to the story of Palestine, that is when I'll be achieving something. And if they go home and change a certain something to the better of the world in their own locale, then they have been, in my opinion, I would say very pro-Palestine. I wanted to take this video as an opportunity to try to help raise funds for an evacuation from Gaza for Nada al-Araj, her husband Ahmed, and their 3 daughters, the youngest of whom is 4 months old. Nada is currently working toward becoming a teacher, and her husband Ahmed and her daughter Maria suffer from epilepsy. If you are in a position to donate, please consider doing so. Thank you so much.